Chapter 5. I could hear the pelting sheets across my window before I opened my eyes. By now the rain was a regular unwelcome visitor. Until very recently it was the only thing I'd hated to see coming. Now, watching it roll off the window pane and disappear, I wished fervently I could join in its journey. There would be no escape today, not when the fields were sopping wet. Daddy would yell at anyone who started out, afraid they might trample the weak stalk struggling to stay upright in the soggy ground. Mama would have a fit to trapped in the house again. I rifled through my desk until I found a granola bar. The expiration had run out, but only by a few weeks. I scarfed it down, envisioning syrup-covered pancakes and crispy bacon. Damn Thomas for coming here and making me a prisoner in my own house. It would have been one thing for him to be over me. I could have swallowed that, eventually. But what was with the brush-off? No, brush-off was the wrong word. He wasn't brushing me off. He was nice, cordial even, like I was some old lady at the grocery store counting pennies. It had been nearly a week, and besides, when I'd nearly flashed him in the bathroom, he hadn't given me a second glance. The minutes felt like hours as I paced my room, my anger with Thomas growing with every step. What was I supposed to do? Quarantine myself for the duration of his visit? Not likely. On the verge of waltzing out and reminding him exactly whose house he was staying in, a car engine started outside. Racing to the window, I saw Daddy. My life had meaning again. I tapped on the glass as I struggled into my raincoat, but he didn't hear me. Racing across the room, I stuck my feet in my shoes, taking the stairs 2 at a time. The tailgate had all but disappeared by the time I flung the front door open. I wondered aloud if they'd taken Jenny. She had a doctor's appointment. Thomas's voice came from behind me, sending a tingle up my spine. Turning around, I found him leaning into the doorframe of the kitchen, already dressed for the day's work, down to the straw-colored cowboy hat on his head. He held a steaming cup of fresh coffee in my mug. My cheeks burned as I struggled to get the stifling rain jacket off. Both of them went? Usually Daddy didn't tag along on doctor checkups. He didn't even go half the time when they were for himself. He nodded, watching me as he took another slow sip from the steaming mug. I could practically taste the rich flavor on my tongue. The road is partially washed out, so your daddy thought it better if he drove. He took a bite of buttered toast, reminding me of the expired breakfast I'd eaten that had done very little to stifle my angry stomach. Nice to be asked, I muttered, as I pulled the last sleeve of my raincoat from my arm and closed the door. I really needed a car. Heck, I'd have settled for a moped. Anything to get some distance from the eyes that were staring a hole through me. Thomas smirked over my blue, Smoky Mountain mug. That did it. What? I demanded, clenching my fists at my sides. Do I amuse you? He didn't answer, taking another slow sip of what should have been my coffee. I started back for the stairs when I caught sight of my pink unicorn pajama shorts and tank top in the hall mirror. Good grief. They didn't exactly go with the camo rain boots and raincoat. I'd planned to leave the coat on, I said stubbornly over my shoulder as I crossed my arms to cover my apparent braless state. My angry tone didn't affect him in the least. At least, he didn't look amused anymore. It was like I was the old lady in the grocery store again. I was too angry to be hurt by it this time. Halfway up the stairs, I stopped. This was my house. If he wasn't going to talk to me, he was sure going to listen. The frustration carried me back down. He hadn't moved an inch. His right boot crossed over his left. Thomas, I started, taking a good look at the man who stared back at me. Now that he'd shaved the light beard, that much to my dismay had made him even more attractive, I could make out the scar on his chin where he'd cut it fixing the tractor back before he'd taken off. I could also make out the small, brown specks in his eyes that kept them from being overtaken completely by the warm hunter green. That color alone was summer in my mind. Looking at him now was like staring at a ghost. I could see the boy he had been. My eyes moved over every inch of him as if seeing him again for the first time, and I felt the breath leave my body. I don't know how long I stood there staring at him, mouth agape, but it must have been longer than intended, because it took him clearing his throat to jar me back to the present. An amused smirk curved his lips as he waited for me to continue. For the life of me, I couldn't remember what I was going to say. Snapping my mouth shut, I stormed back to my dungeon and slammed the door. There were so many things I wanted to say to him. I wanted to tell him how painful it had been each day since he'd left, that it had broken my heart to find his house empty without as much as a goodbye. He should know I never cared for anyone the way I did for him, that for months I waited for his call. I wanted to tell him so many things, but how could I say I love you to a stranger? I hid like a coward in my room until I heard the familiar crunch of Daddy's tires in the gravel drive. If my folks hadn't come soon, I'd have gone out the window in search of sustenance. I headed straight for the kitchen. Waiting on the microwave was not an option. I peeled 2 leftover chicken legs right off the bone and made a sandwich. The way my stomach was rumbling, it was going to take something heavy to quiet it. "Thanks for leaving without me," I said between dry bites. Mama was babying a pouting Jenny who had a bright pink Barbie bandage on her upper arm. Daddy was staring a hole through the kitchen window. "Now why on earth would you want to go to Jenny's checkup?" Mama asked, arching a brow as she peered at me over the shoulder of her beige blouse. The color nearly matched the speckled tan that colored her arms. "Beats sitting around here," I said, forcing down a hunk of bread. She shook her head, turning back to Jenny with a scowl. "You know how crowded that clinic is. That's the last thing we need, someone catching a bug and getting the whole lot of us sick." "I could have sat in the truck," I pointed out stubbornly. "It's not like we abandoned you, Breland," Daddy said without turning from the window, no doubt watching for any sign of the rain slowing. "Thomas was here." "Really?" I said, setting my plate on the counter. "I didn't see him." It didn't slip my attention that Thomas had stepped into the room. My parents would have never left me alone with him back before he'd moved. Daddy would have skinned him alive for even thinking about being alone with me, let alone in our own house. That was the only confirmation I needed that my Thomas was gone. Even my parents could see it. "Rain is stopping," Daddy said, tapping his cigarette pack on the counter, or packing the cigarettes, as he called it. "I reckon I'll go assess the damage." "I'll come, Daddy," I offered, bunching my hair into a ball and wrapping a hair tie around it. We always did these checks together. I had even grown to look forward to them, and with college starting soon, I felt like I had to get in as many as I could. Who knew when I'd be around to help him once classes started? "Thanks, honey. Go ahead and grab that apron in case there's anything salvageable on the ground." "Thomas, you should follow along." I could see from the drive that the mud's overcome that corner fence post. Pretty soon we're going to be chasing chickens again. "Breland, why don't you help Thomas with the fence?" Daddy said, bringing me to a stop. I'd rather help Thomas out of the fence and to somewhere else to stay. "Yes, sir," I muttered, pushing through the screen and hearing Mama fuss as it banged loudly into the house. Thomas was already headed to the back of the coop, but I was sure he'd heard Daddy. I controlled the scowl on my face until I had my back to the house, and then I sent a clump of mud 10 feet into the air with the toe of my boot. It landed against the wheelbarrow. Thomas was already headed to the back of the coop, but I was sure he'd heard Daddy. I controlled the scowl on my face until I had my back to the house, and then I sent a clump of mud 10 feet into the air with the toe of my boot. It landed against the wheelbarrow with a thud. "The mud's worse over here," Thomas said over his shoulder when I started for where he stood by the fence. "Just stay out. I can handle it." He had mud well above his black boots and the cuffs of his worn jeans, shooing the chickens away so he could get a good swing with the hammer. I ignored him, stooping down and bracing the fence post against my knee. "You're just going to get yourself hurt," he said, frustrated, hovering over me with a nail between his teeth. "Just get out of the way." "I was told to help you, and that's just what I'm going to do," I said firmly, blowing at a stray hair that caught my lip. "Help?" He rolled his eyes like the very idea was ridiculous. "I think I know how to fix a fence post." "Apparently not," I said, just as sarcastically. Something about him brought out the 15-year-old in me. "If you'd have fixed it right in the first place, we wouldn't be out here, would we?" That seemed to hit a nerve. He threw his arms up. "Hell's bells, Bree! The ground is too soft. It doesn't matter how many times I put it up. It's just going to fall when it rains like this again." Bree. Just hearing my name pass his lips brought back a rush of emotions I wasn't prepared for. At one time I could have lived off of the sound of his voice saying my name. I stumbled back, losing my footing and landing on my backside. The grin that tugged at his lips helped me to my feet quicker than I would have thought possible. I grabbed the post on both sides and stared defiantly back where he wielded a sledgehammer. He sighed heavily but gave in, bringing the hammer down with a bang. The vibration rang painfully into my hands and up my arms. As much as it hurt, I was not about to let go. My arms would fall off first. Again? He questioned, arching a brow. I nodded, and the hammer came down again. What we really need is cement. With all this rain, it wouldn't do much good either, he said as an afterthought, using his forearms to wipe the sweat from his brow. They had some quick drying at the hardware store last week, I said, waiting for the blood to return to my fingers. I mentioned it to Daddy, but you might want to mention it again. He pushed strongly against the fence. It's still loose, he frowned, the hammer still in his hand. It's good, I said quickly. My hands were done whether he was or not. An animal won't be able to push it as hard as you can. I guess, he shrugged. It's just going to fall again anyway. I turned toward the house to look for Daddy and to stretch my hands without Thomas seeing the pain he'd inflicted. My stiff fingers would barely bend. How are your hands? He asked, wiggling 2 chickens' feet loose from the mud and setting them back inside the coop. Fine, I lied, sticking them behind my back as he came out the gate. Let me see, he said, grabbing my hand before I could protest. You're going to have blisters, he said, running his rough thumb across the pad of my palm. I shouldn't have swung so hard. You tried to warn me, I said, unable to stop the shiver that raced my spine. Traitorous body. I had to keep reminding myself he was a stranger now. You never were one for listening. He almost smiled, but then seemed to think better of it and dropped my hand. I better get back to work, he said, snatching up the hammer and heading to the field without giving me a second look.